It never tells you when exactly you'll be live, and it just kind of like skips right in. So the timer isn't correct, but we should be around, we should be live now at this point. So
Right. Sounds
yeah,
good.
yeah. Sorry everyone, we're probably 2 minutes late at this point, totally due to my fault. I am really bad at getting up in the morning and getting started with my day. So here we are. We're really excited to talk about this today about when it comes to AI ethics in for designers especially. But I'm really excited to have Evan Winston join us today because I've been a big fan of Evan's writing on LinkedIn and also his responses to a lot of folks when it comes to AI and how it might be stealing from artists. So, Evan, if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself and telling us a bit about your background and how you got here.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for having me on and having this conversation. I'm going to do my best to do the subject justice. I definitely don't know everything, so take everything I say with a grain of salt, but I'll do my best. My name is Evan. I am currently, actually, I just quit LinkedIn. So as of last Friday, I was a senior software engineer at LinkedIn. I quit primarily on ethical reasons with the direction that their product roadmap was heading. It didn't align with my principles and what I want for my and my family's future. But this is not about that. Before LinkedIn, which where I was for about 6 years, I did product design for Airbnb. I was the program manager for a coding boot camp in downtown San Francisco. I had a freelance career for about 8 years in that started in visual development. So primarily like animated features and marketing collateral, things like that, and sort of transitioned to front end web development by the end of it. In the move to the Bay Area, it just made sense for supporting a family to bring in a lot more of the technical side of that skill set. So everything from graphic design to product design to some product management or project management, all stuff that I've had a hand in either as a freelancer or contract worker. In the going back to ancient times, you find visual development for animation and some story art, things like that. I still do art direct for a lot of independent publishers, especially in the tabletop role playing game space. So things like Dungeons and Dragons and the offshoots thereof. And yeah, that's the long and short of it. I've got two kids, live in San Francisco, and I'm a pretty outspoken individual when it comes to the subject of AI and copyright and creators' rights.
I love your background because
Thank
oftentimes
you.
I feel like when I find people talking about AI and ethics on LinkedIn, they fall into two camps. Either they're an artist who doesn't really have a technical or tech background, at least,
Mhm.
and they tend to focus primarily on how their works are being stolen, which is perfectly legitimate. And when they argue with other tech focused folks, they tend to not really be able to speak to the technical side of things or what AI is really. They just kind of see it as something, an invisible force that might be stealing from their hard work. And then on the opposite end of the spectrum, we find a lot of tech focused people who don't really have an arts background, who don't do any design. And to them, it's very much about this is the future. Just, get on board or be left behind. And this is just what reality is. So deal with it, right? So
Yeah.
there's this big disconnect. And I love your background because you're able to bridge that. You have a very technical background as a senior software engineer. You do illustration, you do art, you do animation, and you've also been a product designer. So I would love to get your take on a lot of the things that we're seeing right now. So maybe let's start from something really, really simple. Like right now, when we look on LinkedIn, there are memes or common themes going around. You have the Studio Ghibli
Mhm.
Ghiblification of a lot of people's images or photos, and people find that really cool. So you see a lot of influencers, you see a lot of designers, and tech people making a Ghibli version of themselves. You also see the action figure version of who they are, what they do, and on the surface, that seems really fun. You get a lot of
Mhm.
engagement. It's cool. It's like, whoa, this looks just like Studio Ghibli. And on the other hand, you hear about how Hayao Miyazaki is very much against AI because he sees it as something that's soulless, etc. So I would love to get your take on it. Like, is that something that's ethical for us to replicate, to use? And I assume you would think that what OpenAI does is unethical, but as consumers of that product and using it to build engagement on a platform like LinkedIn, what are your thoughts around that?
The easy answer, or the short answer, is no, but that's pretty polarizing, and it's an uncomplicated response, and doesn't really answer the question. So I don't think it's ethical by virtue of how these systems exist, how they were trained, and the exploitation that they exist on top of. But put that aside for a moment, and look at the actual driving forces of these trends, whether it's the action figure trend or the giblification of everything. What they are is market share land grabs. Since OpenAI removed the output guardrails that would have prevented explicitly giblifying an image, they've increased their registrants by multiples, by massive multiples. They've gotten a huge amount of new registrations on the backs of that alone. And so, if nothing else, that is a bit of a red flag as to the motivation behind this move. There's obviously some kind of success as far as they're tapping into something that is very core to the cultural zeitgeist. That's something people very much and very easily respond to. And that a lot of people even demand. There's a huge internet culture and a huge number of subcultures that support and call for a feature like this being available and ready at the click of a button. So, kudos to whoever was observant enough to put this together as a campaign for that land grab that I'm referring to. But I do find it to be extremely unethical, not only because Hayao Miyazaki has come out as very much against AI and the integration of AI in the creative industries, but again, by virtue of how these systems were trained. And the short version of that is millions and millions of frames of copyright protected films produced by Studio Ghibli, as well as any related art, marketing collateral, even fan art that is not protected, have been scraped and included in the training sets. And that's what makes this possible. It's not a sentient machine that is watching Studio Ghibli films in a dark room and suddenly taking the pictures that you're feeding it and redrawing your family portrait in the style of Spirited Away. It's not doing that. It is taking all of the patterns that it observes from the frames of these films that it has copied and stored in its essentially repository, which is what the giant system is, and applied those patterns to a novel subject, which is your family portrait. So that's one part of it. The other part of it is every picture that you feed into this text to image generator is going to be stored and included in future training corpuses. So you're giving it your face and your family's faces and your children's faces. You're giving it more training data. And while there's nothing inherently problematic about willfully going into that with your eyes wide open, I don't think a lot of people do have their eyes wide open on that front. And you brought up a really good point, Heng. In the very beginning, you talked about how people fall into two camps: the artists who are often legitimately bringing up concerns about how their work is being stolen, and the technical or entrepreneurial camp, for whom the notion of work being stolen that is publicly available is just a big nebulous hand wave for them. And it addresses another very fundamental problem to this entire space, which is that since this all started, since Sam Altman said just ship it and Stability AI entered the scene, and we've had these tools widely available to us, artists and creators and writers and voice actors and everyone else who has felt disenfranchised in some way by these companies' approach to copyright and training data have had to wear brand new hats, which is to say, your average storyboard artist should not have to be able to go toe to toe with an engineering manager and a VC manager in a technical discussion, but suddenly they have to. And if they can't, they're wrong. If they can't, they're easy to dismiss. If they can't, everything that they say is just, creative histrionics. And so a lot of individuals for whom these sorts of discussions are so far outside their wheelhouse have over the past 2 to 3 years had to learn how to carry a technical discussion, have had to learn how to carry a legal discussion on IP law and copyright and, the 4 fair use tests and everything else that comes along with this big old can of worms. They've had to catch up in ways that so many of the people for whom it's very easy to just say adapt or die, this is progress, you can't stop human innovation. They haven't had to, simply.
There's so much to unpack there. What
Sorry.
you just said. No, this is great. So first of all, it sounds like one unethical. I mean, there's so many unethical pillars that you've illustrated here, and one of them is that OpenAI basically leverage Studio Ghibli as a marketing platform to further their own ends without compensating them in any way, and they're using their artworks as training data. And obviously, Hayao Miyazaki and Studio Ghibli never agreed to this. This was just done without their consent. And then there's a copyright issue here as well. And I think, and bear with me here because I'm going to ask a ton of really stupid questions just so that we can kind of get through all the stuff that I've been reading on LinkedIn when it comes to this kind of stuff. And one of the key points that people bring up is you cannot copyright a style, right? You cannot copyright anime style. You cannot copyright the Ghibli style, even though when we see it, it's like, oh, that looks like Spirited Away. That looks like My Neighbor Totoro. Like this is clearly influenced by Miyazaki. So if copyright protection does not exist for certain styles like this, why is this still such an issue, both from an ethical and also legal perspective?
Well, speaking from the U.S. perspective, because as I understand it, Canada actually does have protections for artistic style. But putting that aside, speaking from perspective of the U.S. copyright system and U.S. legal system, it's not about the output, and that's really the great prestige that a lot of the AI companies have the talking points that have been fed in order to fuel this discussion in their favor. It's really not about the output. It's very easy to point at the output and say, this is not an image that ever existed before, because it's patterns that have been taken from pre-existing images and pre-existing artwork and applied to a novel subject. But that's not the point. The copyright infringement actually occurs when the original protected data is copied and tokenized and compressed and stored in a commercialized product. All of those frames of Ghibli films, every other individual who has had creative work, creative outputs taken and stored in those training repositories without their consent to then be used to create a commercial product, a commercial subscription service platform, have been infringed upon, because their work has directly led to the output that system is putting forth. It doesn't matter that the output doesn't look like anything exactly like anything that has existed before. It doesn't matter that in the style of is not a protected class for copyright protected works. It matters that the protected works were taken and copied and stored and used in the development of a commercial platform. So you phrased OpenAI's Ghiblification trend as sort of using Studio Ghibli as a marketing partner. And that's not an unprecedented relationship. Plenty of companies will license with Disney in order to use Disney characters as in order to drive a marketing campaign or a marketing platform. And that's an entirely valid and legitimate avenue of business. And yet those characters appear in situations or in frames or in scenes that have never existed in Disney films before. Yes, they're protected characters, but there is no argument there that it is a pre-existing arrangement that requires licensing. Without licensing, you simply cannot do that without getting a cease and desist from Walt Disney, without it generally being accepted as piracy or plagiarism or copyright infringement or trademark infringement. The only distinction here is that the output appears novel, but that is a legal and technical irrelevance. to the nature of the copyright infringement.
I want to dig a little bit deeper in this, and please bear with me. I know this is not a terribly cogent or logical argument, but what if when we look at Disney, right? Like there are key characters that they have, like Snow White or any of the other characters out there. Like we
Yeah.
all know Mickey Mouse, right?
Yeah.
And we can argue that that's a clear copyright infringement if we were to include Mickey Mouse in one of our product lines in our marketing. But it would be, I feel like it would be very hard to argue that you've now stolen Disney's stylistic trend or their style, really. I mean,
Right.
I've seen this video game. I think it's like I forgot the name of it, but it looks like an
It's like
old
old
Disney
Steamboat
animation.
Willie animation with
Yeah,
shooting and a lot of lethality and violence, right?
yes. And I would say that looks clearly like a Disney copy, right?
Mhm.
That's not a novel thing. Nobody can argue that the creator of this video game made this on their own without clear input from old Disney films or other type of animations from the 1900s
Right.
in the US. So why is that okay? But when it comes to studio gamification of your family's photographs, that is not okay.
Yeah, that's a great question and a great example. And yeah, I do know exactly the video game that you're talking about, and it raised quite a stir at the time. Um, First of all, whether or not it's okay, if you're asking from like the legal and ethical perspective, is not necessarily the same thing as whether it's okay from a design perspective, marketing perspective. But I think it's okay because A, the author of that work is a human, which is distinct from an LLM that is capable of existing in potentially infinite simultaneous instances and producing at a scale that is simply incomparable to the scale of output to be expected from that one author who took inspiration from Disney's works or from the early Noodle Arm cartoon era. Um, and also because the nature of the way in which the work is used, you'd have to really consider and look at that from a copyright angle, whether that falls into a category like pastiche or satire or even homage, all of which do exist as protected categories for copyright. And that can be a very fine line. You can use Dr. Seuss's lyricism and style of drawing to create a satire of a Dr. Seuss book that is actually about potty training or something even uglier that is actually about take the butter battle and make it actually about the Cold War and nuclear weapons. That's in most cases I would expect a protected use of Dr. Seuss's style. For instance, there is actually precedence where an author used Dr. Seuss's style and characters to I'm forgetting they used it to engage with a very, very serious, very adult and mature subject. And ultimately the courts held that it was not protected as satire because it didn't use the work in any sort of transformative way. And so that's actually a point that you'll likely hear me bring up later on as we talk more about the nature of the output. But one of the biggest defenses that the advocates for generative AI and the dissolution of copyright as it exists today, one of their great defenses is that AI training of protected data is protected by fair use, which is a US only copyright framework for assessing whether or not the use of a work falls under a certain class of exemption. And one of the biggest considerations there is whether the new work is used in a transformative way. It's called transformative use. And a lot of people will look at the output of generative AI and say, this doesn't look like anything that has existed before. So clearly any protected input that went into the generation of it has been transformed. And that's all well and good, but it's not about the nature of the output. It's about the nature of how the output is used. And so the antithesis to that argument is generative AI, especially text to image, things like that, they all compete in the exact same markets as the protected training inputs in question. They compete in the same commission markets. They compete in the same, even enterprise markets, as you now have Hollywood studios adapting generative AI tools in order to replace VFX artists or sound engineers or voice actors in some cases. And so really that argument doesn't hold water on that basis alone. And this is the same argument that held the court case ruling on Dr. Seuss's work not being adapted in that way. It did not classify as fair use, despite what most people would expect, which is, this is satire, but it wasn't in that case. So that's a pretty fine line to tread. That was a pretty long answer. I think I got off topic there, but
No.
in response to your question about that video game, one, it's a human, not an LLM who authored that game. Two, Disney does have the choice to pursue legal action against that. Successful or not, they have the choice to pursue that avenue. Whereas the scale at which an LLM can produce infringing output renders that choice null and void or meaningless. And I do think that product actually falls under the protection of something like satire.
I see. So the term you use, transformation, I feel like that's a pretty loaded term, and it's almost a legal term as well. Can you simplify that a bit for lay people like me?
Sure. So if you tried to, again, taking the example of, let's take a different example. Let's take Harry Potter. If you wanted to take the idea of Harry Potter, the idea of Harry Potter is not protected by copyright. That's not an aspect of that story, which we're all pretty familiar with, that is protected. The idea of, a magical boarding school and a chosen one hero's journey as they navigate that magical boarding school. Like we've seen that copy and pasted in other media time and time again, even in the same space, like the young adult novel space or Wednesday Addams, whatever it is. That idea is not protected. What is protected is the individual choices that constitute the unique expression of Harry Potter, the novel, or the films. So the characters themselves, Hogwarts itself, the location, the spells, a lot of the elements that, when taken together, constitute the unique mode of expression that is Harry Potter. You copy that and you're in infringing territory. So it's not the idea, it is the expression. That's a key concept there. When we talk about transformative use, it's not about taking the core work and transforming it, incorporating it into a new transformative piece of work if it ends up competing in the same market. So that's really a key distinction here. When you take a piece of a famous painting and incorporate it into a collage, that final output needs to somehow reclassify itself, either competing in a different market, if the painting is protected, of course, competing in a different market, communicating some new meaning or some new form of expression. That's the key litmus test for transformative use. When you take a still of a Ghibli image, a still frame, and you compare that against a Ghiblified family portrait, and you put both in the same internet subculture or the same commission market or the same subculture of fandom, it's not a transformative use by any means at all. And again, it's not about how the end users are choosing to use it. It is how OpenAI or the respective models and model makers are choosing to use these images, which is to undercut artist markets, undercut creative markets, and essentially market dump them in a race to the bottom, a pricing race to the bottom.
So in a way, you're saying when people like me, like a user on LinkedIn, uses OpenAI to create a Ghiblified image of themselves, like I'm not making any money from that image. It's more just to get engagement, which it has value in itself, and you could probably put a monetary value on that. Yeah. The main issue, it sounds like, is the fact that OpenAI and other LLMs are leveraging this technology or this set of works to create value for themselves.
Correct.
And
engagement is its own market, and you as the user are the commissioner in this case. So OpenAI's LLM is the artist that is choosing to infringe on Studio Ghibli by producing output using protected works in the same market.
So one comment I read that was particularly infuriating was that, I mean, there are a lot of them, but it was that in some ways, Studio Ghibli was benefiting from this massive amount of attention being drawn to it.
Mm-hmm.
And that OpenAI wasn't just a key benefactor. Now people are thinking about, hey, this is Studio Ghibli. Let's talk about it. And people who didn't hear about them now have heard about them. And I can
Right.
imagine that the view counts, the rentals, the purchases of Studio Ghibli film has gone up since OpenAI released their latest image generation model. What are your thoughts around that? Where one can argue that Studio Ghibli has also benefited tremendously from this added attention.
Well, I mean, I'd argue that point, but even if we take it as a given, I'd say, so what? It's not. That's not the point. It's not the point. This isn't a, there's no such thing as bad press discussion. The only relevance that would have in a legal discussion would be in determining damages to be paid. But damages are a subsequent conversation to the original infraction or original, tortious incident that Studio Ghibli would have rights to pursue. And that would be the copyright infringement. It doesn't matter if they benefited from this arrangement when they did not enter into it consentingly. They did not consent to it. They were not licensed. Their works were not licensed for this use. This is a commercial use of their work, and they did not agree to this use of their work. And that is the whole point of copyright. Copyright exists for no other reason than A, to incentivize the act of creation, and B, to allow authors, creators, or rights holders the right to determine any commercial use of their work. It's the reason why you're not going to see Donald Duck wearing a swastika. It's because Disney does not want that. Disney does not want anybody to use Donald Duck in that way. And if you see Donald Duck used in that way, it is an act of piracy, which is not an excuse for piracy at scale, which is what OpenAI is doing and the other LLMs. This is not to say that piracy doesn't happen, that plagiarism doesn't happen, that there aren't bad actors, but I see them and their works and, under the table fan art or what have you often used as some kind of indemnification shield for an LLM that is capable of existing in thousands of simultaneous instances and generating thousands of iterations of an image in an extremely short period of time. I somehow see that defended by the fact that some guy chose to put Donald Duck on their privately printed T-shirt. And it's like that is an entirely separate discussion. The system is not perfect. Piracy exists. That's not an excuse for piracy at scale.
Right.
And
Okay.
yeah, exposure is not I think a capital that Studio Ghibli is interested in at this point in time anyway.
I would agree with that. Uh, Jonah Freeman said something really interesting. And I know he is saying this in a sarcastic way, but this is something that we often hear, not only for OpenAI or LLMs, theft of artistic artworks, but I see it oftentimes when a content creator on LinkedIn has their post or their writing or their artwork stolen by other content creators. And one of the key defenses that people often have is that we're not really, this is just what art is. This is what creative work is. Like we're all inspired by each other and nothing is new, right? All these ideas are like, if I talk about some new way of doing something and I write about it on LinkedIn, it's true. Like I didn't come up with this. I read other people's writings. I've read, I've done some work. I've seen how other people do things and I've gleaned that. Now I've created a new post based on that. And none of these ideas are really terribly original, but I've written it and now I'm the author. And if somebody else were to take that, is that right or wrong? And isn't this part of what the creative process is, where we learn from others and then we create new things from it?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's an excellent point. Art, or any kind of creation, very much is us standing on the shoulders of giants. We take inspiration from works that have come before. We learn from works that have come before. In many cases, if you start learning the guitar, you probably are going to be playing Van Halen before you start writing your own music. It's just how it goes. You learn from pre-existing works, and a lot of advocates of Gen AI exceptionalism, as I'll call it from here on out, um, will use that as an argument, or will invoke that quote: good artists copy, great artists steal." So first thing, that quote is often attributed to Pablo Picasso. It's historically dubious whether or not that actually comes from him and not Steve Jobs. But regardless, I think the sentiment is pretty common. It's pretty commonly used in and outside of this space. And it does refer to exactly that. We as humans are inspired by what we ingest as inputs. Um, where was I going with this? Okay. First of all, one thing I'd like to get out of the way is Pablo Picasso is like a terrible human. So I don't like using him as a paragon for any kind of model of human behavior. But moving on from that, that quote is exactly that, a model of human behavior. It is not something that we apply to commercial exchanges. It is not something we apply to companies. And while, yes, companies will take ideas from competitors or from companies that came before and iterate on them, that is still not the same. There's a huge delta between the way in which a human takes inspiration and learns from something and synthesizes a work that they've seen into their own experiences, and filters whatever output they're going to produce that is inspired by that work that they've seen through their own filters of mnemonic memory, of experiences, of their social awareness, of their historical awareness, of their mood at that moment in time, of their, most importantly, intention, liminal and subliminal, their active intention, as well as any intentions they're not even necessarily aware of in that moment in time. All of these things represent a delta, an entire basket of variables that are not in any way part of an LLM's stochastic prediction engine. So to simply compare the two on that basis alone, the fact that the way the human mind is going to synthesize an experience and recreate something from it, versus how an LLM literally will take bits and pieces from its training data and recompile them. It will add noise from other bits and pieces within its training data and recompile them into some sort of output. The sheer process alone on a mechanical, technical level is so fundamentally different that it is laughable to compare the two. An LLM is not a human. Again, I mean, I need to say this way too much, but it is a commercial product maintained by a for-profit company, and it does not have copyrights. It does not have human rights. It does not deserve or have the same considerations as a human creator. So that's thing one, is that the processes are just so fundamentally different. And thing two is, so what? An LLM is not a person. It is not subject to the same rights as someone who holds the copyright on their own work. And then thing three that I would say here is, I may have forgotten it. Where was I going? Yeah, I've forgotten it. It's gone. There's a third thing. I'll bring it up when I remember.
No, this
Sorry.
is great. I love everything you're talking about because you're getting me to think about this in a very different way. I had not considered that our copyright laws were really written for human beings in a more traditional way of creation, and how that is then being licensed out to other human beings or other companies in many cases. And the way we think about how things are created, how things are inspiring us, or how we learn from things is entirely different when it comes to LLMs. So I mean, I definitely want to ask more questions around what are your suggestions around how our laws should change to accommodate this new way of doing things, to say the
Hmm.
least, because there will jobs will be replaced down the line if it hasn't already, and I think we're seeing signs of that happening already. But also, there are other things that OpenAI is arguing for, which is if we are not able to train our data using other people's copyrighted styles, artworks, etc., then other LLMs out there from other countries, like China, for example, would
Hmm.
have a massive advantage against us. And this is more of a national security issue. So, in some ways, it sounds like they're throwing a wrench into it to make you consider something like kind of a fear incentivized argument for why this kind of large scale theft should happen so that the US can stay ahead, its national security reasons, etc.
Hmm.
What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, so that's a really complicated part of the discussion. And I think the first thing I should say is I'm not against the technology. The technology is pretty fascinating, and there are definitely applications for it that are super exciting. All of that has been thrown under the bus in the way that these companies have handled copyright and just sort of doubled down on it over the years as public opinion, as creator opinion, and creative industries have really galvanized a lot of the discussions against them. And now they're doubling down on it again. But in response to that, things like national security, things like the fear of missing out, in the enterprise world, or just being a designer, you want to stay competitive. Um, it's a really difficult one to engage with. The first thing is it is a very deliberately crafted narrative, and so you need to approach that critically. I'm very, very dubious that, your average Dungeons and Dragons commissioner's artwork is going to have an impact on national security. And even more dubious that if it did, it needed to be taken without licensing. And that's really the thing. Like the argument is that if they stop to license training data, which is possible, which does exist in market systems that exist today, even the Spotify model, which is so far from ideal, is a licensing model of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of pieces of creative work for a single service platform. That exists, and that is something that the likes of Microsoft, OpenAI, they have the capital to pursue. And what that does is it brings creators into the value generation loop. And like, I can imagine most of the people that I have known or worked with over the years, a lot of them would not want to be a part of that loop, even if the option were available. And that's fine because they can consent to be a part of that loop or consent to not be a part of that loop. That's the ideal system. It's not about steamrolling that consent, and that's really what's happening. So in response to the national security narrative, the fear of the FOMO narrative that is just spun day after day after day, all of this doesn't need to happen on the exploitation of the creative industries that we rely on. And if it continues to happen in this way, those creative industries are going to be eroded. The talent that goes into them are going to be eroded. The career ladders that lead into them are going to all be cut off at the knees because no one's going to want juniors anymore or be able to justify them from an economic perspective. There are so many ripple effects of just leaning into this full scale and ignoring copyright or rewriting copyright in order to facilitate Gen AI exceptionalism. And DeepSeek is just one more scapegoat that can be thrown on the pile. I don't have the information, the data, or the expertise to comment on an actual national security assessment of DeepSeek or the kind of competition that's needed there. But for what? I mean, if we're now talking about incorporating generative AI into military disposition, then that's a whole other discussion that deserves a whole other layer of ethics and just a desire for future proofing than I have even remotely the expertise to comment on.
So basically, studio Ghiblification of people's artworks really have nothing to do with national security, at least
No.
the way it's being used. Okay, fair enough. I think that's a great answer. Uh, Jono also appreciates your incredibly thoughtful, nuanced answer to his sarcastic, cynical one-liner. I agree as well, me personally, because that's a very common response that people have. So I know we started by talking about artworks, and the reason why I wanted to do that was because I feel like when we talk about artistic licensing or having people's artworks be stolen, that's something that the vast majority of people out there can agree to. Like, that is wrong. That is not great, not just from a legal perspective, but ethically, that is wrong. Even though most of the audience or viewers here are not artists, they're not trained in that way. But many of us are designers, or we're engineers, and when we work with AI at our work, it seems a little bit different, right? We're seeing more engineers leverage LLMs to generate code or to teach them how to, uh, solve certain engineering problems. We're
Hmm.
seeing that a little bit on the design side as well, where you're now able to create user interfaces much
Right.
faster. And I think those areas, it becomes a little bit more gray in some ways because you are able to take other people's code, right? A lot of code out there is
Hmm.
completely open source and open to other people just copying. Like there are licensing, open source licensing in place. And then on the design side, it's hard to argue that you are really stealing, even though all the apps out there look exactly alike, right? Like I cannot read Chinese. And when I went back to China, I used this app called Didi, which is a Uber clone. And even though I could not read Chinese, I was able to figure out how to book the fanciest ride, the Didi Uber Black
Yeah.
version,
Yeah.
because the apps looked identical and I recognized the same patterns, right? So it's very much stolen in that sense. But at the same time, it didn't feel wrong. It felt like this is just what designers do, right? You want to use the same patterns over and over again because people are used to it.
Hmm.
So is this more ethical? Is this more okay? Because there is more of a cultural aspect to leveraging other existing frameworks out there.
Yeah, that's a great question. So first of all, I know that I come off as like a huge naysayer, and I am for a lot of things in a lot of ways. But you've identified definitely a really crucial vector of generative AI use that I think has a lot of application. Um, One of the big problems with using it as a designer or as an engineer is doing so thoughtlessly. But before I get there, you talked about the ethics of it. My first response is, so long as the underlying systems are inherently unethical, which they are, I'm going to find them unethical. I know that people are going to do what they have to do. Companies are going to do, well, forget companies. Individuals are going to do what they have to do. Designers are going to have to do what they have to do in order to stay employed and pay their mortgage. And you're not going to find me disparaging anyone for, I the writing was on the wall at LinkedIn that there are mandates to use generative AI in your workflows, and that has a lot of contribution to why I chose to leave. But that was my choice, okay, and not everyone has the privilege of making that choice. So this is not about disparaging designers for being unethical, for doing what they need to do to stay employed, but I really need them to do it with their eyes wide open. And that the first step of that is recognizing that these systems are fundamentally unethical. Now, as far as using them in a design capacity, say to generate a UI or even to generate code, there's a difference there. One, as you observed, a cultural difference in that code is or UI patterns are generally viewed as open source, either explicitly open source or they're out there for everybody to use and to remix and to see. And two, code and UI patterns often and more easily categorically fall into that basket of ideas as opposed to expression. So expression for a UI would be the color themes that you choose, the palettes, the icons that you choose, the bespoke icons that you choose to use, the bespoke animations, any interaction that is just particularly unique and certainly that uses unique design elements. That's expression as far as UI goes. But click on the shopping cart icon to go to the shopping cart page is an idea. It's an idea of user flow. that I think doesn't warrant the kind of protection that a painting or somebody's voice does. So that discussion requires a really careful consideration of what is idea, which is not protected by copyright, and what is expression, which is. So you talk about ordering a DD show in China, and like if that looks and feels exactly like Uber, is it the flow that feels the same? Is it the where everything is that feels the same, or are they using the exact same icons and colors? And if so, that's where the discussion sort of diverges. So the way I like to think of it is, the ideas that we're talking about, the particular technical user flows, or figuring out what even the happy path is for a very atomic use case, is more like chords in music. They're not something that's going to be copyrighted, or just color schemes, things that are not going to be copyrighted, things that are more on the idea side of things that you can lift and shift. And that's either an act of inspiration or an act of homage or an act of learning from a pre-existing pattern. That is unique from expression. So that's where the conversation gets complicated, but that is really the line in the sand that for me demarcates, using text to image generation versus generating UI patterns and generating code. Now, obviously there is room for thoughtlessly generating UI and thoughtlessly generating code, and there is room for infringingly generating UI and code in that space. But as a wide application of generative AI, that's a safer, more ethical space in which to do it. I don't want that to serve as an indemnification of the way in which the systems are built, or the way in which the ecosystem just carries itself out on LinkedIn, which is reprehensible. But there you go.
Okay, a lot of nuance there.
Yeah,
And
sorry.
no, this is great. I was just going to ask you a dumb question, like, is Lovable an ethical tool to use? Or if I were to use Lovable or V0 or Cursor in my workflow to get my work done and, make money with it, am I doing something that's unethical? And
Again, my blanket answer is going to be yeah, because the systems are unethical. But if we're just talking about in a perfect world where we have an ethically trained generative AI feeding these models and producing these outputs for you, to generate UI patterns, no. To generate UIs, pixel perfect, presentation ready, interaction ready, chosen all of the color palettes for you, chosen all of the bespoke design elements for you, I'd say there's probably a layer of unethical training data use in there. But again, this is assuming an ethically trained model. So the easy answer there is no. However, I would constitute that as like a thoughtless application of Gen AI. Now, in the case of Lovable or a lot of these generative designer focused platforms, the thing that makes this technology so unique and so amazing is the natural language interaction with it, that element of our user experience, that element of its UI, natural language engagement. Do you really need to generate bespoke images for your UI in order to make it work? If you do, you have a design problem. And if you don't, why not just a natural language UI that is able to access a huge repository of existing stock imagery? Do you really need to take this one generated image, which uses a relatively gigantic amount of energy and water waste to generate, by the way, and like change it from day to night? Is that really going to elevate your design? Is that really going to change your deliverable so much that is going to make the difference between success or failure? Or does there exist an image out there that can easily fit the bill for you, that you can simply reach more naturally with an LLM search engine, essentially, an LLM-driven way of retrieving images from all of the stock imagery, stock photography, and artwork that was used to train these models?
The
Does that
term you
make sense?
use, yeah, it does. I have more clarifying questions to ask because you used this term a few times already, thoughtful versus
Mm.
thoughtlessness. And how do you determine if you're using it in a thoughtful way, which sounds like it's more ethical or it's, I mean, we're going to throw legal out the window because
Yeah.
legality be damned at this point. There's no point in talking about that, right? And a lot of defenses I hear from people is that this is perfectly legal. No one's slapped, OpenAI's wrist at this point. So therefore, this is totally okay. So let's focus on ethics because that seems to be the last bastion or last line that some people are unwilling to cross. So is there a correlation between thoughtfulness and ethics? And how do you define what's thoughtful? Like, how do you help somebody like me understand as I make decisions around which tools to use, how to use these tools? As I ask myself, is this a thoughtful way of using it? Is there some kind of a way of approaching this, or is it something more complex?
I mean, I wish I had easier answers to give. For me, again, personally, it is easy, which is it's unethical. Not going to do it. For other people who don't have the privilege of making that decision, I totally get it. We're all stuck between a rock and a hard place, and all of our industries are really suffering right now. But so a link between ethics and thoughtfulness, as long as as long as the underlying system is unethical, my answer is no. But it comes to you got to do what you got to do. And yes, there are ways to use these systems ethically as long as you are thoughtful about it. So thoughtfulness for me most comes into play when you're actually trying to remain focused on your craft, which means you're not like offloading cognitive thought. You're not offloading creative decision making. You are being very deliberate in your intention and working very, very hard to communicate that intention in generating designs. Because you can thoughtlessly iterate hundreds, if not thousands, of different variations on a single design. And that's not really going to help you. If anything, it's going to just give you more work because you're going to have to comb through these very, very thoughtless pieces of output, or you start shaping your own decision-making process around how these outputs affect your way of viewing this project, or affect what you see, or the way in which you view the actual happy path for whatever it is you're designing. Because that's really what a designer is most focused on, how a human user or viewer or recipient is going to be responding to this. And that's a kind of context and meaning that an LLM is not going to have. It's not going to consider. It's not equipped to consider. And it's unable to extrapolate based on, is this actually tapping into a really negative social cue? Maybe it's a very recent one. Maybe it's the giblification trend, that hasn't made it into the training corpus in this way. Is this tapping into that in a negative way? An LLM is not going to have that kind of social context with which to make these decisions. Or is this, a compound enough interaction that is going to feel directly lifted from a competitor app? At the atomic level, I still believe that all of these, like the functionality of an interaction, how you make a component accessible, all of these are in the idea basket, not protected. But when you start compounding them together, you edge closer and closer to the expression basket. And so as a human author, you need to be very conscious of these things that an LLM is not going to be able to track for you. So if you offload all of that onto the generating process, you're not doing yourself any favors. You're opening yourself up to a lot of risk. You're opening yourself up to lazy design. Yeah. So I think at that point, it's not really a matter of ethics so much as why are you doing this?
Okay, so first of all, are you familiar with growth design?
With what design?
Growth design?
Uh, no, I don't think I am.
Okay, well, we'll skip this
Sorry.
part then. That's okay. So somebody a few days ago, my friend showed me this workflow that he came up with, which to me was insane in many ways. And what he did was he would upload a screenshot of his existing feature that he's working on, and he would say something like, "This feature, this screen that I built, isn't it's a little bit too complicated. I think we can simplify it, we can make it better. And he would upload that to ChatGPT and
Hmm.
say a few phrases like how I would like to improve it, and give me some suggestions, and then draw it out. So so ChatGPT would actually give a list of suggestions, a very long one, and then also even spit out the ASCII art in text of
Okay.
what
Wow.
the layout should look like.
Yeah.
And he would take that and he would just copy and paste it into this other AI design tool.
Hmm.
And the crazy thing was that it was a 5 to 10 page long worth of text that he didn't even read. He did not bother reading it at all. He copies and pastes it into this other AI tool, and it would spit out the user interface that ChatGPT created. And I think that is a very definition of not being thoughtful around your design, right? Like you
Right.
basically just came out with a promise that this could be improved through this way. What are you going to come up with, right? And to me, it almost sounded like he was a creative director or like
Hmm.
a director level designer who has a team of designers under him who will do his bidding. And they could be like junior intern level, and they're gonna you go to an intern or a junior designer and you say, I want this page to be improved, and here's the overarching direction that we want you to go in. And then they a day or two later they come back with a UI, and then you can say good or bad, right? And it got me thinking because for a lot of UX designers, it's not about what you like, really. It's more about what
Right.
the users like. And I thought we could conceivably just feed this UI, which is already coded on the front end, and feed it directly to a user research platform,
Hmm.
which will source the users to test through this flow. And all that can be automated, right? It's
Right.
You can just say, ChatGPT, give me a set of questions, and just kind of do a moderated walk case study of this user interface, and you can spit it out. And beyond pressing a few buttons, feeding some credit, you could get a lot of feedback from actual users going through this flow, and who will say this is good, or I was confused by this, etc. And whatever they type out, say I was confused by this flow or this button, whatever, you can then feed it back in
Yes.
to ChatGPT. So this
Yes.
is a very definition of thoughtlessness in terms of design, right? You don't have to make any major decisions. You're just kind of like reading it, and anyone can do this. And
Yes.
on the other hand, I can argue that that is a quite effective way of going about it, because in many ways, design is about iteration, and it's about
Hmm.
trying things out, seeing how people react to what kind of feedback they have for your designs. And how does this fit
Yeah.
in terms of, I mean, obviously we can put in guardrails and say, okay, well, if you see a flow that is deeply unethical, like you're leveraging fear, you're leveraging people's fear of missing out or something else, or some kind of other negative feelings to get them to do something to give you more money, that's bad. But other than that, this, to me, if you were to get this flow right, it could be
Hmm.
extremely efficient
Yep.
and a much faster way of designing things. And I have a hard time saying no to something like that as a designer, because this would easily 5x your productivity.
Totally. Yeah, I agree with that. So what I'd say is that pattern of iteration is a really fascinating one, and it's a cool one for something like UI design and UX design, not for something like art or music or voice acting. So that's an important distinction to draw there. But in these technical roles and these applications, especially in enterprise applications, it's really fascinating, and it could really change workflows. Problems arise when you talked about how any designer can now suddenly be a creative director. Not every designer is ready to be a creative director. Not every junior designer is ready to be an art director. And suddenly putting them in that role, and simply because they can walk through the mechanics of being a creative director and redlining generative AI output, that's not the same. You're still skipping entire rungs of a career ladder of developing experiential input and instincts that are going to be pretty necessary to, again, be thoughtful about what is being generated. That would be thing one. Thing two is these systems are inherently like self-referential. They cannot innovate. They can, as I said, take patterns that pre-exist or that exist in their training data and apply them to novel subjects. That is all. They cannot respond to social trends or social developments and usability expectations. They cannot respond to new modes of accessibility until they are fed back into the training corpus. So at what point does the inability to innovate through the process of iteration, at what point does that hit a wall that starts cannibalizing, the process of creatively pushing the boundaries and pushing the envelope and developing new ways of creating joyful experiences for users on a large scale? All of that said, the upside to being able to quickly test design iterations is huge. And the downside is certainly the lack of ethics of the foundational models, certainly the energy and water usage of each of these iterations, which is not something that should be glossed over. But even more concerning is the erosion of critical cognitive and creative skills in these industries as we come to rely on these workflows more and more. Now, I get it that there are economic realities and corporate realities to weighing skills development versus iteration and move fast and make money. And I have no illusions that corporations are going to do what's in their best interest, but those interests are often short term in perspective and not longer term. And we've seen companies try to eviscerate their creative departments before, or eviscerate their design teams. I mean, even at LinkedIn, I spent like 4 years with no design resources as an engineer, and the product difference of what came out of those years versus when we did have design resources are very, very palpable. But you're absolutely right. If you could find systems that allow you to iterate that quickly and allow you to evaluate the qualitative data that comes out of those tests that quickly, and essentially quantify them, you have a very, very compelling system that it would be difficult for any enterprise environment to say no to. The last thing that I would add here is every layer of generative AI application is by nature non-deterministic. So you could be as confident as you possibly could be. You could have as many guardrails as you want in place that this prompt is going to lead to this outcome with some margin of error, some acceptable margin of error. But that's never going to be the reality in a fundamentally non-deterministic system. There's always going to be a non-deterministic link in the chain. And the more that you layer these systems on top of each other, the more of that risk you're introducing. And the more that you depend on it, the more of the risk of not seeing these problems, this creep of non-deterministic risk, of the kind of risk that comes from lack of context or confusion of contexts, or even contexts that become too complex for a mechanical system like this. You see more of that risk creep into the scope of a project as you layer on more and more of these things, which are essentially wrappers for the same model.
I know we're several minutes over at this point. Do you have a few more minutes to?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. I appreciate it because this is fascinating. I feel like we're just getting deeper and deeper. Yet, I have so many more questions. But what I just described earlier, Tommy says that's a lot like how we're building right now. Lots of thoughtfulness goes into it, but the feedback loop and other elements are super automated. It's super helpful. And if you're not familiar with Tommy he talks about design tooling a lot. And one thing that he's said frequently in the past year or so is that we are seeing a lot more AI assisted tools out there that makes designers 5 or 10 times faster. And now we're getting to the era of design builders or design engineers who can build entire startups or tools or apps on their own without the need of other engineers. Now, that's in many ways giving designers a superpower. that historically speaking, designers never really had in the tech space, right? You could come up with really great ideas, you can design a user interface, but you couldn't really action on it. You needed engineers
Right.
to work with you to build things. And now all of a sudden, designers are unfettered. They're able to build things without other people's help. And to many designers, that is a very freeing or very empowering feeling. So it sounds like there's a, there are competing forces at play. Like
Mhm.
I personally would not ever want to be a junior designer in today's space because it's so scary. Like
Yeah.
where do I fit in? My if my craft abilities are my abilities to strategize or work with stakeholders and to communicate, that usually takes, a decade or more to really get there, isn't there. It's not possible. Like I'm in my 20s, I'm not able to do that. I don't have enough professional experience. So what I really rely on is my craft skills, and that's been completely, you know enveloped by AI.
Hmm.
But that aside, let's forget about the junior designers. Like screw them.
Why
They're
not?
screw. Yeah, why not? Let's get ours, right? If you're a senior designer, you have the taste, the capabilities to be a creative director, to be a director of other designers. Now you're almost in many ways unlocked by these new tools. That's a great feeling. How do we people in this very small area where you're just, you got yours, you can kick the ladder out from under you.
Yeah.
How do you navigate this, right? Because it's just so advantageous. And also, not to say that for a lot of these designers, it's also kind of scary because if you don't adapt to these tools, there's going to be other designers who will, and they're going to be faster and better than you are, at least on paper, at least to other hiring managers. They're going to take the better jobs from you. It feels like there are no other choices. How do you navigate this in a thoughtful way?
I mean, for me, the answer is to fall back on ethics. And so for me, a lot of this discussion, or a lot of what seems to get lost in this discussion, is we are cannibalizing our own industries. Even if we're empowering ourselves to move further and further, every time every single designer that performs the job of 10 designers, that's 9 designers who are probably going to get fired, and that's just for you. Um, that's not a trade-off that for me is in any way worthwhile, because we are not. We don't have we have the privilege of not building our value systems and our career progression on the backs of purely corporate self-interest. And so as long as we have that opportunity and the privilege to make that opportunity, that you're not struggling to put food on the table, that you have the opportunity to take that step back and say, this is not how I want to live. This is not how I want to develop myself as a professional. This is not how I want to see my skill set being utilized or my industry growing. And this is not how I want to see my peers and mentors and professional heroes and professional mentees treated, on a large scale. You should at least ask yourself those questions. So that's my personal take. More pragmatically, I get that that's not always an option. You may have to do what you have to do, but go in with your eyes wide open. Don't find yourself mindlessly ascribing huge amounts of value to every shiny new toy that comes out of the box just because. Don't mindlessly value efficiency over. Don't equate efficiency with professional credibility or professional expertise. Um, Continue lifting each other up, especially where juniors are concerned, because no one else is going to do it for us. Whether I'm speaking as a designer or an artist or even an engineer at this point, no one in the C-suite is going to say, we need to make the industry a better place for XYZ workers. No one in the studio is no one at the top of the studio is going to say that about story artists. No one above the creative director is going to say we need our designers to be happier. That's not going to happen unless we find a way to make that possible. And yeah, that may sometimes be at odds with a completely automated feedback loop of UX research. But there are also, I believe, qualitative considerations there that are not going to be possible for me to articulate at all in this call, if ever. There are many, many people who are more articulate on these issues than I am, and whom you should listen to more. But I do believe that there are qualitative ripple effects that are not being appreciated and that can't be appreciated, and we need to at least pretend that they might exist, rather than double down on the fear of missing out and everything Sam Altman says as the Messiah descending from on high. There needs to be just that much more thoughtfulness and critical engagement with all of the spin and obvious marketing land grabs that are coming out of this ecosystem.
Oof. This is a bad question, but I'm gonna ask it anyway because I feel like a lot of designers are thinking about this, and feel free to ignore it. But if you are a junior designer nowadays and you're coming out of school or out of a boot camp and you had these all aspirations to be a working designer in the tech field, it feels like the way you would approach it would be radically different than say 4 years ago, right? 4 years ago,
Mm.
even when the job market was tough, it's like you learn Figma, you learn this, then you get a job as junior designer, and then you crank out a bunch of stuff. And then you learn and you become a senior designer at some point and you learn these skills, right? It feels like the playbook has been completely rewritten. So if you're
Yeah.
coming out of school right now, how do you navigate this in a thoughtful way? And how do you balance that with your need to pay off your student loan debt? Coming out of art school with
Yeah, yeah,
160K in
yeah,
debt, making
yeah.
40K a year. How do you do this?
Oh, that's so hard. That is a hard question. It's not a bad question. It's a hard one though. As always, you need to eat, to make to put food on the table, and to try to get your foot in the door. I don't want to say you do whatever you have to, because if there's no line in the sand, it's just it's chaos. But you are going to do what you have to do. I'd say that you need to. The short answer is don't lean on the generative AI tools. Try to learn from them as you're using them, as you're learning, as you're leaning on them, as you're consuming them as much as you have to in order to be employable. You need to learn from the ones that came before you. You need to learn from what you're generating, and what, more importantly, what it's doing wrong, as well as what it's doing right. You need to be very critical about anything that you're generating. I don't have a better answer than that, unfortunately. I mean, the reality is the more that you embrace these tools, the less likely it's going to be that the person 2 years behind you in design school is going to be able to pay off their student loans with a design job. But at the end of the day, we're all leaning on very, very heavily centralized tools, which, if they get snuffed out or legally bricked for any reason, or if the FTC comes through with algorithmic disgorgement orders for OpenAI, a lot of people are going to suddenly find their entire skill sets taken away from them because they won't have access to ChatGPT anymore. Now, I know that there are open source models out there. Stability broke the world, but it's still going to be a much, much different landscape. And to embrace this brand new shiny tech toy as the end all be all of a very linear technology tree, like we're playing a game of Civilization, is a dangerous strategy, because there's only so many points of failure there. And if you're an engineer, single point of failure is the worst thing you could have for an application, because there's one point where if something breaks, everything breaks. And the idea here is, take away the generative tools, do you still have a designer? And you want the answer to that question to be undeniably yes. If you have any doubt about it, then you need to at least spend a little bit of time going back to the drawing board and shoring up your skills without the generative tools.
I love that. If you take away that, are you still a designer? That's a really tough question to ask right now. But uh, we're way over time. Do you want to do rapid fire Q&A? Or
Sure, why not?
all right. Do you consider Adobe Firefly to actually be
No,
ethically trained as they
absolutely
claim?
not. No, no, Firefly is the worst. Adobe is the worst, but no, Firefly is an act of very curated ethics washing. First of all, if we really want to get into it, Firefly is trained on Adobe stock, and the stock marketplace automatically opted in all of their historic stock contributors throughout Adobe's lifetime when Firefly was released. So all of those individuals who had contributed to Adobe stock marketplace had been selling work on Adobe stock marketplace and cultivating markets on Adobe stock marketplace suddenly found all their work automatically opted into the training of Firefly. That's thing one that makes it unethical, or at least icky from a business perspective. Legally, Adobe owns the licensing to do whatever they want with anything in Adobe stock marketplace. So there is that. And in that way, it was the most ethical model out there at the time. They owned the rights to do whatever they wanted with anything on stock, and they could exploit their stock contributors as much as they want from a legal perspective. That's thing one. Thing two is Firefly's training corpus is continually updated by what goes into the stock marketplace. And there is almost nothing to stop me from generating dozens of images on Midjourney and uploading them to stock marketplace. So if I do that, even if I were to Ghiblify my own self-portrait and upload it to Firefly, odds are very, very low that it would get flagged as even as AI generated output, much less as output that violates Adobe Stock's community standards or professional standards. So that then enters Firefly's training corpus, which means the older Firefly is, the more it is trained on output, synthetic output from the likes of Midjourney, Stability AI, DALL-E, which are fundamentally unethical models. And all of those outputs come with the metadata, including the prompt that was used to generate those images. So, for instance, artists who do not have any presence on Adobe Stock Marketplace and don't want a presence on Adobe Stock Marketplace found their names being used to generate images in Midjourney and then uploaded to Adobe Stock. So if you search their name in the Adobe Stock Marketplace, you come up with synthetic generated images on Adobe Stock Marketplace that is now being used to feed Adobe Firefly. So no, it is a big old data laundering loop. And data laundering is the best possible term. Data laundering, ethics washing, whatever you need to call it. Firefly is a big old cesspit of duplicitous marketing at best.
Nice. It's just like greenwashing in fashion, it sounds like.
Feel free to hire me,
Yeah.
Adobe.
Yeah. Joanne asked, what about using an AI model to train my own work or my company's work and using that to generate new designs? Can that be ethical? I think I know it. I think I know what you're gonna say.
It's a great question, and one I get a lot. No, as long as the foundational model that you are fine tuning with your own work, because that's the key distinction there. You're not training an AI model on your own company's work unless you have a lot of compute power and are essentially recreating the transformer system that powers these LLMs that we rely on. You're not training an AI model. You are fine tuning one, which is to say you're taking the model that exists today and you are creating basically a subset of that model that is only trained on your work. And so using work that you have the rights to is only trained on your work. That's all well and good. But that new fine-tuned model only exists because of a big unethical copyright infringing aggregation of training data that came before.
Thank you. And this user asks, very informative discussion. Can we address the subject question too? If you do use AI-enabled tools as a designer, what are the ethics to consider? I feel like that might be a really big question. So maybe the real question then becomes, I've learned a lot from you for the past hour, Evan. Where else besides you should I be reading up more on this topic to get a better idea so that I can make my own decisions and have a framework in place to decide?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, there are fantastic people, far more knowledgeable and articulate than I, who are really pushing this discourse in the way it needs to go. I'm happy to provide you a whole list of names, Hang, but just off the top of my head, Dr. Timnit Gebru is definitely one to follow. Johan Sedmar Brandstedt, sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, Johan, is my North Star for most of these issues. He's fantastic. There's a lot of people out there, and if you want to reach out, I can provide anybody independently with that list. I'll certainly provide it to you, Hang, and you can post it after the fact or whatever you want to do with it. But a lot of the best conversations are happening on Substack. There's plenty more of engagement happening on LinkedIn. All I'd really recommend as sort of a broad strokes here is try to keep an eye out for people who are remaining critical of even the most blue skies claims coming out of OpenAI, Microsoft, and all of the garbage about deleting all IP law.
All right, let's wrap this up. I really appreciate your spending so much time with us. I've learned a whole lot. Please follow Evan Winston at his website. You can see a lot of his illustrations there. They're really great. And please follow him on LinkedIn as well, because I love your writing. I love seeing you dismantle certain people's arguments on LinkedIn. Some of them are just really, really awful. And it's fun seeing that smackdown, at least from my perspective. People
I
are,
try to stay civil, but I fail most times.
yeah, but some of the arguments I've seen out there are pretty damn stupid. So, yeah, thank you everyone for watching for more than an hour at this point. I really greatly appreciate your viewership. And Evan, thank you so much as well. I've learned so much. You're incredibly articulate through all these questions that we've had, and some of the questions are pretty bad. So
No, not
appreciate
at
your
all.
patience.
Not at all. Thank you for having me. This has been a lot of fun, and it's important conversations to have. I hope that I address the designer specific sphere of this enough, because I know it's a lot, and it's a varied thing to unpack.
Thank you. I'm gonna end the stream now, so I'll see you folks around.